Latin, lingua latina or Latinum, is a classical language belonging to the Italic branch of the Indo-European languages. Latin was originally spoken by the Latins in Latium, now known as Lazio, the lower Tiber area around Rome, Italy. Through the expansion of the Roman Republic, it became the dominant language in the Italian peninsula and subsequently throughout the Roman Empire. It has greatly influenced many languages, including English, having contributed many words to the English lexicon, particularly after the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons and the Norman conquest. Latin roots appear frequently in the technical vocabulary used by fields such as theology, the sciences, medicine, and law. By the late Roman Republic, Old Latin had evolved into standardized Classical Latin. Vulgar Latin refers to the less prestigious colloquial registers, attested in inscriptions and some literary works such as those of the comic playwrights Plautus and Terence and the author Petronius. While often called a dead language, Latin did not undergo language death. Between the 6th and 9th centuries, natural language change in the vernacular Latin of different regions evolved into distinct Romance languages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Latin remained the common language of international communication, science, scholarship, and academia in Europe into the early 19th century, by which time modern languages had supplanted it in common academic and political usage. Late Latin is the literary form of the language from the 3rd century AD onward. No longer spoken as a native language, medieval Latin was used across Western and Catholic Europe during the Middle Ages as a working and literary language from the 9th century to the Renaissance, which then developed a classicizing form called Renaissance Latin. This was the basis for Neo-Latin, which evolved during the early modern period. Latin was taught to be written and spoken at least until the late 17th century, when spoken skills began to erode. Contemporary Latin is generally studied to be read rather than spoken. Ecclesiastical Latin remains the official language of the Holy See and the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church. Latin grammar is highly fusional, with classes of inflections for case, number, person, gender, tense, mood, voice, and aspect. The Latin alphabet is directly derived from the Etruscan and Greek alphabets. A number of phases of the language have been recognized, each distinguished by subtle differences in vocabulary, usage, spelling, and syntax. There are no hard and fast rules of classification. Different scholars emphasize different features. As a result, the list has variants as well as alternative names. In addition to the historical phases, ecclesiastical Latin refers to the styles used by the writers of the Roman Catholic Church from late antiquity onward, as well as by Protestant scholars. The earliest known form of Latin is Old Latin, also called Archaic or Early Latin, which was spoken from the Roman Kingdom, traditionally founded in 753 BC, through the later part of the Roman Republic up to 75 BC, i.e. before the age of Classical Latin. It is attested both in inscriptions and in some of the earliest extant Latin literary works, such as the comedies of Plautus and Terence. The Latin alphabet was devised from the Etruscan alphabet. The writing later changed from what was initially either a right-to-left or a boustrophedon script to what ultimately became a strictly left-to-right script. Classical Latin. During the late Republic and into the first years of the Empire, from about 75 BC to AD 200, a new Classical Latin arose, a conscious creation of the orators, poets, historians, and other literate men, who wrote the great works of classical literature which were taught in grammar and rhetoric schools. Today's instructional grammars trace their roots to such schools, which served as a sort of informal language academy dedicated to maintaining and perpetuating educated speech. Vulgar Latin. Philological analysis of archaic Latin works, such as those of Plautus, which contain fragments of everyday speech, gives evidence of an informal register of the language, Vulgar Latin, termed sermo vulgi, the speech of the masses, by Cicero. Some linguists, particularly in the 19th century, believe this to be a separate language, existing more or less in parallel with the literary or educated Latin, but this is now widely dismissed. The term Vulgar Latin remains difficult to define, referring both to informal speech at any time within the history of Latin, and the kind of informal Latin that had begun to move away from the written language significantly in the post-imperial period, that led ultimately to the Romance languages. During the classical period, informal language was rarely written, so philologists have been left with only individual words and phrases cited by classical authors, inscriptions such as curse tablets and those found as graffiti. In the late Latin period, Language changes reflecting spoken, non-classical norms tend to be found in greater quantities in texts. As it was free to develop on its own, there is no reason to suppose that the speech was uniform either diachronically or geographically. On the contrary, Romanist European populations developed their own dialects of the language, which eventually led to the differentiation of Romance languages. Late Latin. Late Latin is a kind of written Latin used in the 3rd to 6th centuries. This began to diverge from classical forms at a faster pace. It is characterized by greater use of prepositions and word order that is closer to modern Romance languages. For example, while grammatically retaining more or less the same formal rules as classical Latin. Ultimately, Latin diverged into a distinct written form, where the commonly spoken form was perceived as a separate language, for instance early French or Italian dialects, that could be transcribed differently. It took some time for these to be viewed as wholly different from Latin, however. After the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 and Germanic kingdoms took its place, the Germanic people adopted Latin as a language more suitable for legal and other, more formal uses. Initially, Latin was also retained by the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, as the language of the government and legislation, even though the vast majority of its population spoke Greek and other Eastern languages, such as Syriac and Coptic. It even enjoyed a brief flowering as the language of the great codification of laws, the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian I, himself a native Latin speaker. After Justinian I's death, the gradual territorial retreat of the empire and its near collapse in the wake of the Muslim conquests led to the near extinction of Latin as a spoken and official language. The surviving rump Roman state replaced Latin with the Greek language. Latin was retained on coinage and in some court ceremonies until the 11th century, albeit often in a ritual and fossilized form. In a surviving letter from the late 9th century, the Carolingian Emperor Louis II invoked the fact that the Byzantine imperial chancery struggled to write in proper Latin as an argument in his ideological dispute over who was the rightful Roman emperor. Romance languages. While the written form of Latin was increasingly standardized into a fixed form, the spoken forms began to diverge more greatly. Currently, the 6 most widely spoken Romance languages by number of native speakers are Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, and Catalan. Despite dialectal variation, which is found in any widespread language, the languages currently existing in Spain, France, Portugal, and Italy have retained a remarkable unity in phonological forms and developments, bolstered by the stabilizing influence of their common Christian, Roman Catholic culture. It was not until the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in 711, cutting off communications between the major Romance regions, that the languages began to diverge seriously. The spoken Latin that would later become Romanian diverged somewhat more from the other varieties, as it was largely separated from the unifying influences in the western part of the empire. Spoken Latin began to diverge into distinct languages by the 9th century at the latest, when the earliest extant Romance writings begin to appear. They were, throughout the period, confined to everyday speech as medieval Latin was used for writing. For many Italians using Latin, though, there was no complete separation between Italian and Latin, even into the beginning of the Renaissance. Petrarch, for example, saw Latin as a literary version of the spoken language. Medieval Latin. Medieval Latin is the written Latin in use during that portion of the post-classical period when no corresponding Latin vernacular existed, that is from around 700 to 1500 AD. The spoken language had developed into the various Romance languages. However, in the educated and official world, Latin continued without its natural spoken base. Moreover, this Latin spread into lands that had never spoken Latin, such as the Germanic and Slavic nations. It became useful for international communication between the member states of the Holy Roman Empire and its allies. Without the institutions of the Roman Empire that had supported its uniformity, medieval Latin was much more liberal in its linguistic cohesion. For example, in classical Latin sum and eram are used as auxiliary verbs in the perfect and pluperfect passive, which are compound tenses. Medieval Latin might use fui and fuerum instead. Furthermore, the meanings of many words were changed and new words were introduced, often under influence from the vernacular. Identifiable individual styles of classically incorrect Latin prevail. Renaissance and Neo-Latin. Renaissance Latin, in use from around 1300 to 1500, and the classicized Latin that followed through to the present are often grouped together as Neo-Latin or New Latin, which have in recent decades become a focus of renewed study, given their importance for the development of European culture, religion, and science. The vast majority of written Latin belongs to this period, but its full extent is unknown. The Renaissance reinforced the position of Latin as a spoken and written language by the scholarship by the Renaissance humanists. Petrarch and others began to change their usage of Latin as they explored the texts of the classical Latin world. Skills of textual criticism evolved to create much more accurate versions of extant texts through the 15th and 16th centuries, and some important texts were rediscovered. Comprehensive versions of authors' works were published by Isaac Casaubon, Joseph Scaliger, and others. Nevertheless, despite the careful work of Petrarch, Politian, and others, first the demand for manuscripts, and then the rush to bring works into print, led to the circulation of inaccurate copies for several centuries following. Neo-Latin literature was extensive and prolific, but less well known or understood today. Works covered poetry, prose stories, and early novels, occasional pieces and collections of letters, to name a few. Famous and well-regarded writers included Petrarch, Erasmus, Salutati, Celtus, George Buchanan, and Thomas More. Non-fiction works were long produced in many subjects, including the sciences, law, philosophy, historiography, and theology. Famous examples include Isaac Newton's Principia. Latin was also used as a convenient medium for translations of important works first written in a vernacular, such as those of Descartes. Latin education underwent a process of reform to classicize written and spoken Latin. Schooling was conducted largely in Latin until approximately 1700. Until the end of the 17th century, the majority of books and almost all diplomatic documents were written in Latin. Afterwards, most diplomatic documents were written in French, a Romance language, and later native or other languages. Education methods gradually shifted towards written Latin, and eventually concentrating solely on reading skills. The decline of Latin education took several centuries and proceeded much more slowly than the decline in written Latin output. Contemporary Latin. Despite having no native speakers, Latin is still used for a variety of purposes in the contemporary world. Religious use. The largest organization that retains Latin in official and quasi-official contexts is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church required that Mass be carried out in Latin until the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965, which permitted the use of the vernacular. Latin remains the language of the Roman Rite. The Tridentan Mass, also known as the Extraordinary Form or Traditional Latin Mass, is celebrated in Latin, although the Mass of Paul VI, also known as the Ordinary Form or the Novus Ordo, is usually celebrated in the local vernacular language. It can be and often is said in Latin in part or in whole, especially at multilingual gatherings. It is the official language of the Holy See, the primary language of its public journal, the Acta Apostolici Sedis, and the working language of the Roman Rota. Vatican City is also home to the world's only automatic teller machine that gives instructions in Latin. In the Pontifical University's postgraduate courses of canon law are taught in Latin, and papers are written in the same language. There are a small number of Latin services held in the Anglican Church. These include an annual service in Oxford, delivered with a Latin sermon, a relic from the period when Latin was the normal spoken language of the university. Use of Latin for mottos. In the Western world, many organizations, governments, and schools use Latin for their mottos due to its association with formality, tradition, and the roots of Western culture. Canada's motto E mari usque ad mare, from sea to sea, and most provincial mottos are also in Latin. The Canadian Victoria Cross is modeled after the British Victoria Cross, which has the inscription, For Valor. Because Canada is officially bilingual, the Canadian medal has replaced the English inscription with the Latin Pro Valori. Spain's motto plus ultra, even further, or figuratively further, is also Latin in origin. It is taken from the personal motto of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, as Charles I, and is a reversal of the original phrase non terrae plus ultra, no land further beyond, no further. According to legend, this phrase was inscribed as a warning on the Pillars of Hercules, the rocks on both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar and the western end of the known Mediterranean world. Charles adopted the motto following the discovery of the New World by Columbus, and it also has metaphorical suggestions of taking risks and striving for excellence. In the United States, the unofficial national motto until 1956 was E pluribus unum, meaning, out of many, one. The motto continues to be featured on the Great Seal. It also appears on the flags and seals of both houses of Congress and the flags of the states of Michigan, North Dakota, New York, and Wisconsin. The motto's 13 letters symbolically represent the original 13 colonies which revolted from the British Crown. The motto is featured on all presently minted coinage and has been featured in most coinage throughout the nation's history. Several states of the United States have Latin mottos, such as Arizona's Ditat Deus, God enriches, Connecticut's Ca transtulit sustinet, He who transplanted sustains, Kansas's Ad astra per aspera, through hardships, to the stars, Colorado's Nil sine numini, nothing without providence, Idaho's Esto perpetua, let it be perpetual, Michigan's Si queries peninsulam aminum, circumspice, if you seek a pleasant peninsula, look about you, is based on that of Sir Christopher Wren in St. Paul's Cathedral. Missouri's Salus populi suprema lex esto, the health of the people should be the highest law. New York's Excelsior, ever upward. North Carolina's Esse quam videri, to be rather than to seem. South Carolina's Dum spiro spiro, while I breathe, I hope. Virginia's Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. And West Virginia's Montani semper liberi, mountaineers are always free. Many military organizations today have Latin mottos, such as Semper Paratus, always ready. The motto of the United States Coast Guard, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The motto of the United States Marine Corps, Semper Supra, always above. The motto of the United States Space Force, Per ardua ad astra, through adversity/struggle to the stars. The motto of the Royal Air Force, RAF. And Vigilamus pro te, we stand on guard for thee. The motto of the Canadian Armed Forces. Some law-governing bodies in the Philippines have Latin mottos, such as Justitiae Pax Opus, the work of justice is peace. The motto of the Department of Justice, Philippines. Some colleges and universities have adopted Latin mottos. For example, Harvard University's motto is Veritas, truth. Veritas was the goddess of truth, a daughter of Saturn, and the mother of virtue. Other modern uses. Switzerland has adopted the country's Latin short name Helvetia on coins and stamps, since there is no room to use all of the nation's 4 official languages. For a similar reason, it adopted the International Vehicle Code CH and the Internet top-level domain CH for Confederatio Helvetica, the country's full Latin name. Some film and television in ancient settings, such as Sebastiani, The Passion of the Christ and Barbarians, 2020 TV series, have been made with dialogue in Latin. Occasionally, Latin dialogue is used because of its association with religion or philosophy. In such film/television series as The Exorcist and Lost, Jughead, subtitles are usually shown for the benefit of those who do not understand Latin. There are also songs written with Latin lyrics. The libretto for the opera oratorio Oedipus Rex by Igor Stravinsky is in Latin. The continued instruction of Latin is seen by some as a highly valuable component of a liberal arts education. Latin is taught at many high schools, especially in Europe and the Americas. It is most common in British public schools and grammar schools, the Italian Liceo Classico and Liceo Scientifico, the German Humanistisches Gymnasium and the Dutch Gymnasium. Occasionally, some media outlets, targeting enthusiasts, broadcast in Latin. Notable examples include Radio Bremen in Germany, YLE Radio in Finland, the Nuncii Latini broadcast from 1989 until it was shut down in June 2019, and Vatican Radio and Television, all of which broadcast news segments and other material in Latin. A variety of organizations, as well as informal Latin circuli, circles, have been founded in more recent times to support the use of spoken Latin. Moreover, a number of university classics departments have begun incorporating communicative pedagogies in their Latin courses. These include the University of Kentucky, the University of Oxford and Princeton University. Legacy: Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Romanian, Catalan, Romansh, Sardinian, and other Romance languages are direct descendants of Latin. There are also many Latin loanwords in English and Albanian, as well as a few in German, Dutch, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish. Latin is still spoken in Vatican City, a city-state situated in Rome that is the seat of the Catholic Church. Literature. The works of several hundred ancient authors who wrote in Latin have survived in whole or in part, in substantial works or in fragments to be analyzed in philology. They are, in part, the subject matter of the field of classics. Their works were published in manuscript form before the invention of printing and are now published in carefully annotated printed editions, such as the Loeb Classical Library, published by Harvard University Press, or the Oxford Classical Texts, published by Oxford University Press. Latin translations of modern literature such as The Hobbit, Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, Paddington Bear, Winnie the Pooh, The Adventures of Tintin, Asterix, Harry Potter, Le Petit Prince, Max and Moritz, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, The Cat in the Hat, and A Book of Fairy Tales, Fabulae Mirabiles, are intended to garner popular interest in the language. Additional resources include phrasebooks and resources for rendering everyday phrases and concepts into Latin, such as Meissner's Latin phrasebook. Inscriptions. Some inscriptions have been published in an internationally agreed, monumental, multi-volume series, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. Authors and publishers vary, but the format is about the same. Volumes detailing inscriptions with a critical apparatus stating the provenance and relevant information. The reading and interpretation of these inscriptions is the subject matter of the field of epigraphy. About 270,000 inscriptions are known. Influence on present-day languages. The Latin influence in English has been significant at all stages of its insular development. In the Middle Ages, borrowing from Latin occurred from ecclesiastical usage established by St. Augustine of Canterbury in the 6th century or indirectly after the Norman conquest, through the Anglo-Norman language. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, English writers cobbled together huge numbers of new words from Latin and Greek words, dubbed inkhorn terms, as if they had spilled from a pot of ink. Many of these words were used once by the author and then forgotten, but some useful ones survived, such as imbibe and extrapolate. Many of the most common polysyllabic English words are of Latin origin through the medium of Old French. Romance words make up 59%, 20% and 14% of English, German, and Dutch vocabularies, respectively. Those figures can rise dramatically when only non-compound and non-derived words are included. The influence of Roman governance and Roman technology on the less developed nations under Roman dominion led to the adoption of Latin phraseology in some specialized areas, such as science, technology, medicine, and law. For example, the Linnaean system of plant and animal classification was heavily influenced by Historia Naturalis, an encyclopedia of people, places, plants, animals, and things published by Pliny the Elder. Roman medicine, recorded in the works of such physicians as Galen, established that today's medical terminology would be primarily derived from Latin and Greek words, the Greek being filtered through the Latin. Roman engineering had the same effect on scientific terminology as a whole. Latin law principles have survived partly in a long list of Latin legal terms. The Logodarese dialect of the Sardinian language and Standard Italian are the two closest contemporary languages to Latin. Education. Throughout European history, an education in the classics was considered crucial for those who wished to join literate circles. The prominence of Latin in classical education rested not only on tradition but also on its reputation for clarity, logical structure, and intellectual rigor, a view expressed by the mathematics educator Theodore Hugaz, who remarked that Latin, it is mathematics, language mathematics. This also was true in the United States, where many of the nation's founders obtained a classically based education in grammar schools or from tutors. Admission to Harvard in the colonial era required that the applicant can readily make and speak or write true Latin prose, and has skill in making verse Latin study, and the classics were emphasized in American secondary schools and colleges well into the antebellum era. Instruction in Latin is an essential aspect. In today's world, a large number of Latin students in the United States learn from Wheelock's Latin, the classic introductory Latin course, based on ancient authors. This book, first published in 1956, was written by Frederick M. Wheelock. Wheelock's Latin has become the standard text for many American introductory Latin courses. The numbers of people studying Latin varies significantly by country. In the United Kingdom, Latin is available in around 2.3% of state primary schools, representing a significant increase in availability in Germany. Over 500,000 students study Latin each year, representing a decrease from over 800,000 in 2008. Latin is still required for some university courses, but this has become less frequent. The Living Latin movement attempts to teach Latin in the same way that living languages are taught, as a means of both spoken and written communication. It is available in Vatican City and at some institutions in the U.S., such as the University of Kentucky and Iowa State University. The British Cambridge University Press is a major supplier of Latin textbooks for all levels, such as the Cambridge Latin Course Series. It has also published a subseries of children's texts in Latin by Bell and Forte, which recounts the adventures of a mouse called Minimus. In the United Kingdom, the Classical Association encourages the study of antiquity through various means, such as publications and grants. The University of Cambridge, the Open University, a number of independent schools, for example Eton, Harrow, Haberdashers' Aske's Boys' School, Merchant Taylors' School, and Rugby, and the Latin program /Via Facilis, a London-based charity, run Latin courses. In the United States and in Canada, the American Classical League supports every effort to further the study of classics. Its subsidiaries include the National Junior Classical League, with more than 50,000 members, which encourages high school students to pursue the study of Latin, and the National Senior Classical League, which encourages students to continue their study of the classics into college. The league also sponsors the National Latin Exam. Classicist Mary Beard wrote in the Times Literary Supplement in 2006 that the reason for learning Latin is because of what was written in it. Official status. Latin was or is the official language of several European states. It had official status in the Kingdom of Hungary from the 11th to mid-19th centuries, when Hungarian became the exclusive official language in 1844. The best-known Latin language poet of Hungarian origin was Janus Pannonius. Similarly, in the Kingdom of Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Latin was officially recognized and widely used between the 10th and 18th centuries, commonly used in foreign relations and popular as a second language among some of the nobility. Latin was also the official language of the Croatian parliament from the 13th to the 19th century, 1847. The oldest preserved records of the parliamentary sessions, Congregatio Regni Totius Sclavini Generalis, held in Zagabria, Croatia, date from April 19, 1273. An extensive Croatian Latin literature exists. Latin was used on Croatian coins on even years until January 1, 2023, when Croatia adopted the euro as its official currency. Vocabulary. As Latin is an Italic language, most of its vocabulary is likewise Italic, ultimately from the ancestral Proto-Indo-European language. However, because of close cultural interaction, the Romans not only adapted the Etruscan alphabet to form the Latin alphabet but also borrowed some Etruscan words into their language, including persona, mask, and his trio actor. Latin also included vocabulary borrowed from Oscan, another Italic language. After the fall of Tarentum in 272 BC, the Romans began Hellenizing, or adopting features of Greek culture, including the borrowing of Greek words, such as camera vaulted roof, cymbalum, cymbal, and millennium, bath. This Hellenization led to the addition of Y and Z to the alphabet to represent Greek sounds. Subsequently, the Romans transplanted Greek art, medicine, science, and philosophy to Italy, paying almost any price to entice Greek skilled and educated persons to Rome and sending their youth to be educated in Greece. Thus, many Latin scientific and philosophical words were Greek loanwords, or had their meanings expanded by association with Greek words, as ars, craft, and technique, art. Because of the Roman Empire's expansion and subsequent trade with outlying European tribes, the Romans borrowed some northern and central European words, such as beaver, of Germanic origin, and bracy breeches, of Celtic origin. The specific dialects of Latin across Latin-speaking regions of the former Roman Empire after its fall were influenced by languages specific to the regions. The dialects of Latin evolved into different Romance languages. During and after the adoption of Christianity into Roman society, Christian vocabulary became a part of the language, either from Greek or Hebrew borrowings or as Latin neologisms. Into the Middle Ages, Latin incorporated many more words from surrounding languages, including Old English and other Germanic languages. Over the ages, Latin-speaking populations produced new adjectives, nouns, and verbs by affixing or compounding meaningful segments. For example, the compound adjective, omnipotens all-powerful, was produced from the adjectives omnis all and potens powerful by dropping the final s of omnis and concatenating. Often, the concatenation changed the part of speech, and nouns were produced from verb segments or verbs from nouns and adjectives. Numbers. In ancient times, numbers in Latin were written only with letters. Today, the numbers can be written with the Arabic numbers as well as with Roman numerals. The numbers 1, 2, and 3 and every whole hundred from 200 to 900 are declined as nouns and adjectives, with some differences. Unus, una, unum, masculine, feminine, neuter. 1. Duo, dui, duo f, n. 2. 2. Trace, tria /f, n. 3. 3. Quatuor, I or 4. 4. Quinque, b. 5. Sex, 6. 6. Septem, 7. 7. Octo, ix or 8. Novum, I or 9. 9. Decim, x. 10. Quinquaginta, 50. Centum, c. 100. Quingeni, quingenta, f, n, d. 500. Mil, 1000. The numbers from 4 to 100 do not change their endings. As in modern descendants such as Spanish, the gender for naming a number in isolation is masculine, so that 1, 2, 3 is counted as unus, duo, trace. Pronunciation. Latin pronunciation. Latinum. Native to Latium, ancient Rome. Ethnicity. Latins, Romans. Era as a native language. c. 7th century BC-C. 8th century AD. Language family. Indo-European to Italic to Latino-Faliscan to Latin. Early form Old Latin. Writing system. Latin, Latin alphabet. Official status. Official language in Vatican City. Regulated by Pontifical Academy for Latin.